Hello and welcome back to Knit Your First Hat. This is part two of the series. In part one we talked about reading the pattern and finding your size, doing a gauge swatch, and we cast on. So today we're going to do the next step, which is to knit this hem, or no, the brim of the hat, which is this stretchy kind of ribbing, like a corrugated pattern here, formed by knitting knit and purl stitches alternatingly. So I'll start off with some theory explaining what knit and purl stitches are, and then we will get to the actual knitting in a second. So let's think about how knitting works. And it's worth mentioning that knitting, you might associate it mostly with hats that look like this, but actually knitting makes up a surprising amount of our fabrics. So t-shirt fabric, for example, if you zoom in on it and look very closely, it is exactly the same principle. It is exactly the same stitch, but just with much thinner yarn. If you've ever looked closely at your knitting or at a knit fabric, you will see it looks a bit like these kind of columns of little V's that are kind of interlocking. And how that is made is actually you start off with this kind of wavy yarn, and then you get other waves that go through it. So what we're doing when we're knitting is actually creating this kind of undulating yarn pattern that then interlocks with the next row. So if you picture that this grey yarn at the bottom is the first row, and this white yarn, or maybe I should have picked the brown one with the contrast, I'll do it again in a second, so is the second row. Can you see how I've actually done exactly the same thing? A yarn that goes like this is then repeated on this second row. Can you see that? It's actually the same stitch, but just that they're interlocking. And so that is why we need a needle here to stop those from slipping through the row below. So you can see we've got two rows here at the moment, each made up of 4 stitches. So we've got the grey row with 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches, and the white row with 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches. Right, let's move on to how this works using needles. So if you imagine that my left needle is like this, we're going to use this right hand needle to essentially pull the yarn through there, like so, and then slip the other needle away, and there you go, you've got 4 stitches. The loops, again, like on the previous row, are going, if I line that up, you can see it looks a bit twisted at the moment. So you can see how, oh, get in there, come on. Okay, just imagine there isn't a loop on there, it's not behaving. So you can see again how that goes up and through and up and through, and that is how we build up the whole kind of knitting pattern. Now, because we are knitting a hat, we're not knitting a flat piece like this where you would just keep going back and forth upwards. We're actually knitting in a spiral, kind of like a snake coiled, if you will. Yeah, we're knitting a coil, or a, what are those things called that go down the stairs? A slinky, where you go kind of up and build up and up and up, and build your hat up that way. So essentially we've gone from this cast on edge and we've gone round and round and round till we get to the top, where we started decreasing the number of stitches to make that crown. Now you might be wondering, so how does this differ from that? So here you can see you've got rows of V's, columns of little V's, sorry, that are lined up, and those V's are actually this bit. So you can see how, because the next yarn goes on top of the loop at the top, what's left kind of sticking out is this V here and that V there. Can you see those? And that is what, on a much smaller scale, looks like V's there stacked on top of one another. So each V is 1 stitch, and that's a really helpful way as well to count how tight your gauge is, or to make sure you had the right number of stitches or something like that. You can always count, if you've got the number of V's going upwards, that's how many rounds or rows you've got, and you've got the V's going next to each other, that's how many stitches you've got. Now, to create this kind of corrugated effect, you alternate doing one knit stitch and one purl stitch. A knit stitch is what I've just done here, the kind of plainest form of knitting. A purl stitch is just that from the other side. So a purl stitch looks like that with this bar on top, rather than the V of the white looking out, you'll have the bar of the white crossing the next loop that's kind of sticking out. I brought another hat to demonstrate this. So here you can see I've alternated having 2 knit stitches with 2 purl stitches. And if I show you the end there, you can see how what's a knit stitch here and a purl stitch there is a knit stitch and a purl stitch. So can you see how they're actually just the back or the reverse of one another? So in a normal knit stitch, what you would do, so if you had this, let's say I was knitting the next row after the brown, in a normal knit stitch, and I'll show you this again several times, so don't worry, you would go like this from left to right under the current left needle, then you'd put your new yarn from left to right, and then you would pull it through to the front like that, and you can see that would create the same loop pattern that we've currently been making. Can you see that? So a purl stitch is everything in reverse. So instead of starting off with the yarn at the back, we would start off with the yarn at the front, and we would put our needle from right to left rather than from left to right, and the yarn as well from right to left, and then pull from the front to the back rather than the back to the front. Oh, sorry, it's so loose, it's hard to... And can you see how that has created, instead of the new yarn going over the previous loop, it's now going under the previous loop at the top. So we've done exactly the opposite of here, where the legs are under and the loop is on top. Here we've got the legs on top and the loop underneath. Can you see I've just repeated that there? And can you see how that makes that corrugation a bit clearer of the knit and purl stitch, knit and purl stitch? And then we would do that all the way around, and it will give us that corrugated effect and add some stretch in there. So that's what we're now going to do without these huge loops, on a much smaller scale. Right, so once you have cast on the number of stitches that it says, so if for example you were doing the baby size, that would be 64 as it says here on the pattern. Once you do that, we're going to join this in the round. Now make sure when you're counting your number of stitches that you're casting on, don't count that first one that is just like a little twisted loop. Only count the ones that are like this, that have a proper kind of loop at the bottom, and you can already see how stretchy that is there. Right, so when you meet the two at when you kind of join them together, you're going to have more cord, because no one has a, well, head this big, maybe adult L, you'll be able to join it like this, depending on the size of cord that you have, but most hats are smaller than the circumference of this needle. So that's where we use something that most people call magic loop. All we're going to do is kind of pull a bit of wire out of the middle so that it essentially makes the circumference of your needle smaller, like that. So when you join it, you want to make sure that that ridge that you've just created during your cast on is all pointing the same way. So you don't want it going under and over like this, because then you won't be building it all up in a kind of a nice conical, in a nice cylindrical shape. So make sure that all the kind of cast on edge here with the bumps on is all pointing inwards when you join it up. So yeah, that's the case for me. And make sure that now you pick up the bit of yarn that is connected to your ball, not the little short end. And you should have it kind of looking like that. And move, yeah, have that yarn away from you. So yeah, on that side, on the other side of the knitting compared to where you're sitting. Right, now that I've got all my stitches nicely lined up, I'm going to join this up. So the first stitch, oh, and you can see sometimes if you've got very few stitches like I have, it'll even pop out by itself unintentionally. I just wanted to say that after watching it back, I changed the pattern instructions slightly. So don't worry, I've published it with the correct instructions. So you saw what happened. I kind of needed to take out in 2 spots. So let me just illustrate that again. So rather than, like I said, taking out in 1 spot for the magic loop, I would recommend pulling it out in 2 spots like that, so roughly 1/3 each, although it doesn't matter. You've got this marker so that you can remember where your round starts and ends, and that way when you then push your needles through like that, you get kind of like a triangle effect. And the first stitch, like I said, is not a real stitch, it's just that loop we made at the beginning. So I'm just going to slip that to the other needle and kind of just leave it there for now. So you can see I've gone from having it as a straight line into a loop just from kind of doing that. Now this is where we do our first knit stitch. So we're going to put the needle on into this loop like that, moving it from left to right and to the back. Then we're going to take the yarn, this is the yarn connected to my ball, and hook it onto that back needle from left to right as well. Hold it there. Then we want to pull out the right needle from the back towards the front like this, so that you've still got your new length of yarn on there, and then you can slip off the one that it came through. Now next, because we're alternating one knit and purl stitch, we need to bring that yarn to the front through the middle of the needles, and this time we're doing everything in reverse. So into the front, from right to left towards the front, and the yarn from right to left as well, and then pull it from the front to the back and slip that off. So I'm going to repeat that several times. The right needle goes from left to right through that stitch and towards the back. You take your yarn and pass it between the 2 stitches from left to right, and then pass the yarn through, catching that new yarn, and that's how you've made a loop. Everything in reverse, we bring the yarn to the front. This is for a purl stitch. So now right to left on the front side of the needle, right to left with your yarn, and pass that needle through so it catches the yarn that I've just put on there, and then you can pull it off the old loop. Okay, let me show you that a few more times. So hopefully that's not confused you too much. We repeat that all the way round. So again, knit stitch, yarn at the back, left to right towards the back, yarn also from left to right, and then back through to the front. Let me just do that. Oh, and a purl stitch, so we're doing everything in reverse. Yarn to the front, needle right to left, yarn right to left, and pull it to the back. Right, now let me do this one more stitch and then show you what happens when you get to one of the breaks in your yarn. So all you need to do in this case, when you've arrived at the point where your cord was sticking out, is to pull the cord through a different part of your knitting, like that, until it's on that first needle again. And there you go, you're back to how you want it to be, shall we say. And again, because my cast on loop is so small, I need to have it sticking out in more places, but that's fine. Right, so again, so we just did a knit stitch. You can see when it's like a V, that means that you've just done a knit stitch. When it's like a bump, that means that you've just done a purl stitch. Yeah, can you see that? That's a V and that's a bump. So knit stitch, purl stitch. Here we see a V, there we see a bump or a bar. Here we see a V, there we see a bump or a bar. Okay, so that's how you know that you've gone knit, purl, knit, purl. So because I just did a knit stitch, my next one has got to be purl, so I bring the yarn to the front, right to left in the front, right to left with the yarn as well, and pass it to the back and slip it off. Now knit stitch, yarn to the back, needle from left to right towards the back, yarn from left to right, and pass it through. Right, so now you can repeat one knit and one purl, one knit, one purl, one knit, one purl stitch all the way around until you come to your last purl stitch. So on my this is my last stitch here, and you can see that that's the case because I've got the tail coming out of the base of that last stitch in my round there. Okay, so you can remember at the beginning we slipped that first stitch, which was just like a loop, it wasn't a proper stitch. So now to kind of join the two ends of the cast on row together, we're going to do the purl stitch with both the last loop of the round and that first stitch that wasn't really a stitch together. So you're going to put your needle through both, take your yarn that's coming off the ball and do a purl stitch like you've been doing around the first time and slip them off together. So you've essentially joined those two, and that's it. You're back at the beginning, or you've finished your first round, and this is where we are going to insert your beginning of round marker. If you ordered the kit from me, you will have received stitch markers like these, so just select one of them, and I'm going to pop it on my needle at the end of my first round. Now I can go on to my second and do exactly the same thing as I did the first time round. You can see here I've got a V, so that's a knit stitch, and that makes sense because we started with a knit stitch. So I'm going to knit that one, and then that next one has kind of got like a bar on it, which means it's a purl stitch, and we're going to purl that one. Yeah, then the yarn back to the back and knit, and the yarn back to the front and purl. And you're going to go round and round like that until you get the length or the height that the pattern tells you to get. So you can see here there's an option for a single or a double thickness rim, and you'll have the length in centimeters. So this hat comes with two options. You can either have this folded over brim, or you can have a single brim version that you wouldn't fold over. So the regular kind of single brim would be half the length of ribbing compared to this option because you're not folding it over. So make sure you measure your size for the right option, but hopefully that's clear in the pattern. So just keep going round, going one knit, one purl, one knit, one purl stitch all the way round until you get that length. And when you get to the desired length of ribbing, we'll do the next row and start the plain section here in video number 3. Thanks so much for watching. Do subscribe to be notified about when video 3 and subsequent videos go up. If you have any questions, comment below or send me an email. Check out my Instagram and so forth. Thanks so much for watching. Bye!